Hi guys, this is Nikki, your visual arts teacher, and welcome to the video tutorial for your second case study from the Ashes. This video just aims to give you an overview of German Expressionism and its development at the time, just providing a foundation for the rest of our study. Okay, so let's just begin by making a connection to our previous case study, which was called Art Space. Now, hopefully you recall that we were looking at the development of the gallery space over time and the rules and regulations that had been imposed upon artists, and the fact that they were starting to challenge what was deemed as acceptable subject matter and what could be displayed within the gallery space, and how this has evolved over time. In essence, we looked at the way artists were beginning to take back control over the type of works that they could create. Bearing this in mind, we are going to focus in on the early 20th century and an art movement known as German Expressionism. Now, German Expressionism forms under the greater umbrella of modernism, and therefore it adheres to a lot of the rules of modernism, and we'll have a look at those in a moment. But just to, I suppose, give you a quick recap of German Expressionism, we've got artists who are moving towards the idea of expressing themselves in an emotional capacity. Therefore, the focus of their work was aiming to explore the emotional state of both the artist and the subject matter that they were depicting. In addition to this, we've got the changing role of the audience, who now within modernism is required or being asked to impose their own subjective view on a work. They're being asked to interpret the piece. Therefore, when they look at the works created by these artists during this time, they're looking at being able to impose their own emotional response to the artwork as well, and to use that to formulate their interpretation. Now, one of the key ideas presented within German Expressionism was this belief that there was more to the world than simply what the eye saw. So I want you to pause this video for a moment and just take note of this phrase, but also create a little mind map of, well, what could this actually mean? Now, as you know from being in my class, it's very, very difficult to study an art work or an artist or an art movement without placing it in time and context. So let's just revise our understanding of modernism briefly in identifying that it started at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Actually, for most of the 20th century, let's be honest. But at this time, we've got a world that is on the brink of change. All right, industrialization had occurred in the late 19th century, causing social change, a lot of technological advances, and basically the developments that were being created from this was having a ripple effect into society and culture at large. Right. Now, at the time, people were convinced that these developments in science and technology was a path to a better world. All right. And therefore, with all of this type of innovation, you saw artists who were also seeking new forms of expression, new ways of doing things, moving away from the rules and regulations that had been previously established, again, connecting to our art space study of last term. Now, naturally, this led to a lot of experimentation and a range of different art movements. And this is why, under this big umbrella of modernism, we have so many different art movements, because they were all sort of experimenting with different ways of representing ideas. However, when artists were sort of attached to a particular movement, they did follow conventions and established rules, and that's why when you look at their works, you can often see similarities in terms of their style or their physical characteristics. So, and I've said this to you previously in class, we've got a range of different movements spurting up, but these groups of artists almost, had a little bit of a pack mentality in terms of what was deemed acceptable if they were going to be a part of that particular art movement. Now, just to give you some greater context in terms of leading up to modernism and the establishment of German Expressionism within modernism, we're just going to go back before modernism for a quick second, again drawing on some of the information that we were learning in our art space study. All right, so if we look at realism as a trigger point in terms of a shift occurring in the acceptable subject matter and the way the subject matter was depicted, and a great quote that sums this up is by Gustave Courbet, which is to paint the people for the people. All right, so we've got this movement that is looking to depict reality, all right, the mundane, everyday events that were occurring. Okay, previously to this, you had a lot of heroic, emotionally charged images, often depicting the upper or middle class, royalty, war heroes, etc. But the realist artists looked to the working class. And this was challenging because the working class were not deemed as appropriate subject matter. To be honest, majority of the working class weren't accessing the gallery space at all, so how dare they be on the walls? Okay, so you had this real shift in what was actually being created. Now, you also had the starting point of artists starting to explore the science of light and optics. And this is important because it filters into a modernist movement, which is known as Impressionism, which hopefully when you're looking at these images, you have seen them before, Monet and Pissarro. All right, with the Impressionists, you have, again, these artists drawing on realism in that they're depicting what they see. All right, they're going out into the world. And this was relatively new in the sense that they now had access to paint tubes. They were using smaller canvases, so they could go out into the landscape and create what was known as an impression. So almost like a quick sketch and scribble. Their focus, however, was looking at the way the light shifted and changed. So, for example, an artist could go out in the morning and create one scene, and then they could go to the exact same place 7 hours later, and the work would be completely different because of the way the light hit the subject matter, right? And in some respects, we have to take into account that this is based on the subjective view of the artist. So the colours that they see through their own eyes. And so I mentioned that, and I want you to keep that in mind as we move towards Expressionism and this move towards artists imposing their emotional response or their emotional state into the work. Now, Impressionism, of course, was followed by the art movement PostImpressionism. Okay, and in some respects, it was a reaction against the opticality of the Impressionist movement. Okay, so the study of light and atmosphere. All right, now this is where the subjective vision of the artist really started to flourish and be more present in the type of works that were created. Right? They saw it as an opportunity for their works to provide insight into the artist, their mind, their feelings, their psychological and emotional states. Right, so no longer were they focused on depicting, the landscape and what they saw out, but they started to turn their gaze inwards, to look at their own memories, their own emotions, their own experiences, in order to create a connection with the audience that I guess was deeper and strong. Okay, and that sort of summed up with this idea that nature is not only what's visible to the eye, but it includes the inner pictures of the soul. Okay, and this idea of shutting one's eyes in order to see, the idea of blinding themselves in order to look inwards, and that was a real key focus of the post-impressionist artists. And hopefully you can see through this very quick brief history lesson that we have this evolution that is taking us towards expressionism. All right, and more specifically German expressionism. Okay, so again, connecting to our art space study, we have the academies of art still trying to control what could be displayed. Okay, so like the artists in France, the German artists began to scream out for a new form of expression. Okay, now the realists had already started exploring different forms of subject matter, right, and this idea of reality. Okay, and then obviously we've started to move towards a more emotional sense. So we've got reality plus emotional state of the artist, which of course can lead to some very, very interesting dynamics and very, very interesting artworks that are being presented. All right, so what we need to understand is the artists are depicting their own personal response to what was going on around them, the experiences that were happening. Okay, so in a sense, it's a reaction against, but also an extension of the art movements that came before it. Now, I've just sort of said that these artists were responding to the world and events around them. Okay, so again, reinforcing this idea of time and context, right? It is the world to artist connection if we're dealing with the conceptual framework. Okay, but we need to understand Germany as a nation and what it was going through and how that may have been impacting upon the artists at the time. Okay, so firstly, we've got a series of things happening prior to the outbreak of World War I. And I flag World War I because it's such a big contributing factor to the subject matter of artists, and therefore we sort of let it sit there and recognize that this is going to change the game a little bit. Okay, so prior to this we have Germany being united, okay, under one ruling empire. All right. As a result of that, Germany then went under quite an extreme industrial revolution. Okay, and this is important because it revolutionized their trade and it made them the second only to England as a trading nation. So very progressive, I suppose, and rich. And this economic strength was highly reflected in its military budget. Okay, so therefore it's starting to compete with the other nations in terms of its army and in terms of its navy, which means that Germany becomes quite a threat if the world should go to war. And naturally, with all of these large powers happening like this, the scene is definitely set, and as we know, World War I is imminent. Now, because of this and all of these revolutions that were sort of happening in an industrial sense, and I've sort of previously mentioned it at the beginning of this video, all of this progress is reflected in the artists and their need to explore new ways to express themselves. Now, what's interesting to note is that many of the Expressionists actually welcomed the war. They believed that it was going to be some form of apocalyptic event that would overthrow the self-satisfied materialism of the nation's monarchy and the bourgeois, so the middle class. Okay, so they actually saw this as a good thing, to the point that many artists actually enlisted in active duty. And this is a good point to note because you'll see this reflected in their artworks as we explore the artists in greater detail. Right. However, majority of artists going into World War I did truly believe that the war was not going to last as long as it did. So by 1915, weariness and devastation had just led to a lot of negative attitudes towards the war. So majority of people really didn't believe that they should be in the war anymore and they wanted to stop. And this is highly reflective in the artworks, particularly of the 1920s, where artists started to respond to this violence and needed to exercise the bitter memories that were sort of taking up space in their mind from the experiences of the war. Now, it's important for us to highlight the influence of Edvard Munch on the German Expressionist artists, okay? And the reason for this is because we've got an artist, and you can see by looking at the screen here that he's depicting the world as shown through the eyes of someone who is in pain. Okay, so no longer are things from a rational standpoint where as a viewer you're looking from the outside. Instead, you are thrown in to this scenario where the landscape, you know, in this particular work, you know, is deafened and impacted by this scream, and therefore as a viewer you experience the scream as well. You embody the person in pain. In your study guide, there's actually some more information on Edvard Munch and a scaffold where you can analyse this particular work. I would encourage you to complete that task at some point because it will prove highly beneficial to your further study of German Expressionism. Now, German Expressionism has two predominant groups working. The first of which was in Dresden, known as Die Brücke. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Also known as the Bridge, and this was established in 1905. Now, the works that were created by artists within this group were often very, very bold, highly colourful, in which they use the colour in a symbolic and unnatural way. Okay, so colour as emotional symbolism. Okay, and the works were highly emotive. They often incorporated a very graphic style and even connections to more primitive African art. This was evident through their use of lithography and woodcuts. Now, there was definitely in some of the works a social and political response to what was going on. Some of the artists that are associated with this particular group is Kathy Kollwitz, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Paula Modersohn-Becker, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, and Erich Heckel. You'll have an opportunity to study one or more of these artists at your own discretion as we continue through this case study. So if any of those images seem to catch your eye, then that might be one of the artists that you focus on. The second group that was established in 1912 in Berlin is known as the Blue Reiter or the Blue Rider. Again, apologies for my pronunciation. All right, now this particular group promoted the psychological use of colour and line. Okay, so we're continuing on from the Bridge in this sense, in terms of their exploration of colour as a form of symbolism and emotional connection. Now, further to this, they started to explore the connection between man and nature. And this was highly evident in the work of Franz Marc, who often incorporated animals into his work. Now, what's interesting about this particular group is that we see a movement towards pure abstraction, which would be an art movement that sort of comes after German Expressionism, where we're moving away from any recognisable subject matter. And so it's this pure psychological emotional response. Now, some artists that are associated with this particular group, again, if one of these catch your interest, then you may choose to study them in greater depth as we continue this study. So you've got Wassily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, Gabriel Monta, and Paul Klee. Now, please note that the Bridge and the Blue Rider were established prior to the outbreak of World War I. We then have a third group that come out of the woodwork after the end of World War I. And I cannot pronounce their name, I apologise, but in English it translates to new objectivity, which in itself is quite fascinating because we've got this, I guess, idea of seeing something new in an objective light for the first time after the turmoil of World War I, noting that Germany was blamed for the war. Therefore, Germany as a whole was in complete disarray. Poverty, destruction, it was not a great time to live. Okay? But you've got new artists that are coming out, and these works are really a depiction of Germany at the time and what was happening, and putting all of those things that were terribly uncomfortable in your face. Artists such as Otto Dix and Max Beckham are some examples of that. Unfortunately, each of those artists briefly presented would later go on to be part of an exhibition known as Entartete Kunst, the Degenerate Art Exhibition of 1936, organised by Hitler and the National Socialist Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party. These artists would be humiliated and ostracised for their work, something that we will explore in greater detail as we investigate the Degenerate Art Exhibition. This video tutorial hopefully gave you foundational knowledge in regards to the development of German Expressionism and what was going on in the world at the time. Concepts that will be expanded upon throughout our study.